welcome back. Tonight, we open a door the world was never meant to see. Beneath the stones of Vatican City lies a vault, shrouded in centuries of silence, a place where history itself was locked away. They say inside are not just holy relics, but dangerous truths, sealed so tightly that even popes feared to look too closely. Imagine shelves of forgotten gospels, maps of worlds erased from memory, and letters from voices history tried to smother. It's a vault where beauty and terror sit side by side, where faith, power, and fear collided. As always, you don't need to like or subscribe, unless these journeys truly speak to you. But if they do, it helps us keep exploring the hidden corners of time together. And tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? I love seeing our constellation light up across the night. There are places in the world that seem more legend than reality, places spoken of in whispers rather than written plainly. Beneath the marble and stone of Vatican City rests one such place, a vault so carefully concealed that even many who serve in the heart of the Church have only heard fragments about its existence. For generations, the Vatican Apostolic Archive, once called the Secret Archive, has been the subject of speculation and mystery. The very name misleads, for it is not secret in the sense of being unknown, but secret in the sense of being forbidden, controlled, and restricted. What lies inside is not simply fragile parchment preserved against the wear of time, but knowledge considered too dangerous for common eyes. Within its locked chambers are accounts of councils, letters between rulers and popes, testimonies of trials, and manuscripts from civilizations long vanished. Officially, it is said to be preserved for scholarship and safekeeping, and a small number of academics are sometimes granted access under heavy conditions, but only to specific documents they can name, and even then their access is narrow. They cannot browse, they cannot wander the shelves. The true contents remain unknown to nearly all, and for centuries this has fueled both fear and fascination. The air around this vault is said to grow cold as one approaches, not because of the stone, but because of the awareness of what waits behind those sealed doors. It is not only the history of faith that rests inside, but the history of humanity, one that challenges the neat version told in textbooks. Tonight we begin at that threshold, standing before the door of the vault that the Vatican fears above all. Whispers of this hidden chamber have drifted through centuries like echoes in a cathedral, faint but persistent. Priests in training have spoken of it in hushed tones. Archivists who served their time in the endless corridors of the Vatican have hinted at shelves they were never allowed to enter, and travelers who brushed against the edges of Rome's ecclesiastical heart carried away stories of passages beneath the earth. Official maps show nothing unusual, yet beneath the surface runs a labyrinth of storerooms, chambers, and locked halls. Among them lies the vault so feared, sealed, and guarded more carefully than any treasury. The weight of silence surrounding it is itself a form of testimony. If there were truly nothing extraordinary within, why should so many barriers exist? Why should layers of approval and secrecy be woven like a cloak around it? These rumors were never born from imagination alone. Records exist of papal decrees that ordered certain manuscripts to be withdrawn from sight. There are references in old letters to texts that could not be released for fear of confusion, scandal, or rebellion. The Church has always preserved its history with care, but it has also chosen what form of that history is allowed to be seen. The result is a vast underground repository that exists both as a library and as a shadow. For some, it is the ultimate safeguard of faith. For others, it is the place where truth itself was chained, and for centuries, it remained sealed, the world above continuing on, as if nothing lay hidden beneath its feet. Yet whispers never ceased, because silence, no matter how strong, cannot erase memory. Among the most persistent rumors is the existence of a key, not just a physical piece of metal, but a permission granted only to the highest guardians of the church. In stories passed quietly through scholarly circles, this key is said to open doors that even senior clerics never knew existed. It is not found in ordinary inventories, nor is it displayed in ceremonial halls. It is entrusted to very few, each bound by sacred oath never to reveal what it unlocks. The secrecy surrounding it is deliberate, for to admit the existence of such a key would be to admit that there are chambers intentionally withheld, knowledge purposefully hidden. In history, popes have spoken vaguely of archives that must never be disturbed, of records that could shake the faithful if mishandled. The power of this mystery lies not only in what is kept, but in the very act of keeping it. A locked door provokes curiosity, but a locked door that is never acknowledged provokes something far deeper. Scholars who spent lifetimes studying church documents often confessed that what troubled them most was not what they read, but what they could not even request to see. The vault is said to contain material so classified that its very titles are restricted, catalogs written by hand and kept from circulation. The supposed key, whether symbolic or real, represents this barrier. It embodies the line between the history we are allowed to know and the history that has been deliberately veiled. What terrifies those in power is not the key itself, but the possibility that someday it might be turned by the wrong hands, and the vault might finally yield its secrets. The question that lingers through the centuries is why even popes themselves showed hesitation toward the vault. The office of the papacy carries authority unmatched within the church, yet not every pontiff chose to open every door available to them. Some spoke only in generalities about the dangers of certain texts. Others ordered shelves to be moved, sealed, or even erased from the official record. The reluctance is telling. It suggests that what waits in those depths does not merely challenge the faith of the everyday believer, but unsettles the very foundations of authority. A pope who confronts documents describing early teachings at odds with official doctrine might find himself burdened with impossible choices. A pope who discovers records of agreements with kings or rulers that contradict the clean version of history might risk destabilizing the trust of nations. Silence becomes the safer course. To acknowledge too much is to risk unraveling centuries of careful narrative. This is why popes themselves, even with absolute access, have often chosen distance. They were not ignorant of what was there, but they understood the weight that such knowledge carried. It is one thing to inherit a faith with mysteries, another to hold in your hands a truth so sharp it cuts through the very fabric of tradition. And so many chose not to disturb what rested below, leaving it sealed for another age, another reckoning. This hesitation from those at the highest rank is perhaps the strongest evidence that the vault holds more than brittle parchment. It holds the potential to rewrite history itself. Those who stand closest to the vault are not popes or cardinals, but the archivists, men sworn to a life of order, detail, and silence. Their work is quiet, methodical. the cataloging of centuries of human memory. Yet behind their calm presence lies a burden few could bear. They move among shelves that stretch like endless corridors, preserving letters, decrees, and chronicles that have survived wars, plagues, and empires. Some of them have spoken only in veiled words after leaving service, hinting at rooms they were instructed never to enter, documents they were told existed but must never request. The oath they swore was not just to protect the Church's history, but to guard its hidden heart. For many archivists, the silence became heavier than the work itself, a silence that followed them into old age. Imagine knowing of maps that point to forgotten lands, or texts that tell of councils where decisions were far different than what the faithful were later taught, and being unable to speak of it. This silence was not chosen freely. It was demanded, enforced by tradition and obedience. The archivist was both keeper and prisoner, bound by the same walls that locked away the knowledge he served. And so generation after generation, the vault remained untouched by the world outside, guarded by those who never dared to reveal what they truly knew. Their silence became the strongest lock of all, more secure than stone or iron. There came a day, whispered about, but never officially recorded, when the seal of the vault was disturbed. Not by accident, not by neglect, but by deliberate choice. The moment is said to have been marked by an unsettling stillness, as if the air itself waited to see what would follow. Those who describe it speak of a draft that felt older than the walls themselves, a cold breath carrying the dust of centuries. The door, heavy with iron and carved with symbols of authority, groaned, as though it remembered every hand that had touched it before. When it finally gave way, the chamber beyond revealed not grandeur, but an austere silence. No light filtered in except the faint flicker of lanterns carried by those who entered. Dust swirled in the air, making the space feel both endless and suffocating. For the first time in generations, the hidden shelves stood revealed, lined with manuscripts, scrolls, and volumes bound in cracked leather. The very act of crossing the threshold was an intrusion, a trespass into a history that had resisted discovery for so long. Every step forward carried the weight of countless warnings and prohibitions, yet curiosity pressed on, stronger than fear. That first breach was not only a physical opening of a door, but a symbolic fracture in centuries of silence. It meant that what had been hidden was no longer perfectly contained, that the vault was no longer only legend, but an exposed reality. And once opened, even briefly, it could never again be sealed in the same way. The first sensation upon entering deeper into the vault was not sight, but smell, the distinct weight of forgotten centuries pressing into the lungs. The air was thick with the must of aged parchment, ink faded into the fibers, candle smoke that once clung to robes long gone, and the faint sweetness of beeswax from seals unbroken. It was a scent that spoke of time suspended, a perfume of preservation and secrecy. The walls seemed to absorb sound, as if every whisper was swallowed before it could echo. The faint scratch of footsteps across stone stirred up more dust, turning the dim lantern glow into a haze. Shelves rose like ancient guardians, lined with manuscripts whose spines bore no titles, only codes known to the archivists who had catalogued them. Here, history was stripped of its familiar warmth and displayed in its rawest form, heavy, untamed, and silent. Each bundle of pages held in its fibers the lives, choices, and secrets of generations. To those who entered, It was as if the vault itself resisted intrusion, offering its presence with a chill that cut deeper than the stone around it. Nothing here was casual. Every sealed letter, every bound record, carried the weight of deliberate concealment. Standing there, one could almost feel the lives that had been erased in order to keep these shelves from ever reaching daylight. It was not simply a room of knowledge. It was a tomb for truths the world was never meant to inherit. Among the shelves were discoveries that defied reason, maps unlike any that appeared in common atlases. These were not charts of familiar continents, carefully outlined and colored with precision, but sketches of places that should not exist. Coastlines curved where no sea was known, mountain ranges crossed, lands thought to be empty, and annotations in Latin hinted at voyages forgotten or deliberately erased. Some maps bore the mark of explorers whose names were absent from official histories, their journeys omitted as if they had never taken place. Others showed lands drawn with startling accuracy, despite being centuries ahead of modern cartography. To gaze upon them was to feel a rupture in time, a suggestion that human eyes had once seen farther than we are told they did. The question arose unbidden. If these places had been charted, why were they hidden? Perhaps they revealed knowledge that challenged the story of discovery as taught to generations. Perhaps they suggested that entire civilizations rose and fell without leaving a trace in the textbooks we rely upon. In this vault, geography itself became dangerous, because it dared to whisper that our world was not mapped only in the ages we were told, but long before, by hands we no longer remember. The power of these maps was not just in their lines and symbols, but in the silence surrounding them. A silence that erased worlds as effectively as any storm. To unroll one was to hold in your hands a glimpse of a past deliberately concealed, and that was enough to understand why they were buried in darkness. Scattered among the shelves were bundles of letters, sealed long ago and never meant for the eyes of the common world. These were not the quiet correspondence of ordinary men, but the desperate writings of thinkers and scientists whose discoveries unsettled the order of their age. Some wrote of the heavens, describing movements of stars that contradicted accepted teaching. Others spoke of machines imagined centuries before their time, devices that, if revealed, could have altered the balance of power. These voices were silenced in life, condemned as heretics or dreamers, their works confiscated and hidden. Yet within the vault, their words endured, preserved in ink, though their names were erased from public memory. Reading their pleas was like hearing echoes of a conversation deliberately cut short, ideas locked away before they could reach the world. Many of the letters bore signs of haste, written as warnings or confessions, begging that their discoveries not die with them. Some addressed directly to popes, some to kings, others simply written for whoever might one day open them. The fact that they remained sealed spoke volumes about the choice made by those in power. Knowledge was not destroyed, but buried, not erased, but imprisoned, waiting for centuries behind these locked doors. To hold such a letter was to feel the weight of what might have been, a path of history redirected by silence. And in that silence, one could sense the fear that knowledge, once released, cannot be controlled. Among the most unsettling discoveries whispered about from the vault were fragments of Gospels that never found their way into the Bible. These texts carried accounts of the earliest believers, voices that spoke of visions, teachings, and encounters now considered outside the accepted canon. In these forgotten writings, Angels were not painted as gentle protectors in flowing robes, but as forces of awe and terror, described as fire, storm, and thunder. Their presence shook the ground, their voices shattered the air, and their appearance inspired fear more than comfort. These depictions clashed with the softened images that later filled stained glass windows and illuminated manuscripts. Some of these Gospels even questioned details of stories that millions grew up believing, offering versions that painted a different picture of faith's beginnings. Their very existence explains why they were locked away, for such texts would have raised questions no authority could easily answer. The Church preserved them, not because it wished them to be known, but because to destroy them would leave evidence of suppression too obvious to deny. So they were placed deep within the vault, untouched, their words suspended in darkness. To read even a few lines was to feel a shiver of recognition that history, as we know it, has always been curated. The pages did not seek to replace faith, but they revealed how complex its origins truly were. In their silence, they waited, testaments to a time when the story of belief was still unfolding and uncertain. And it is that uncertainty that those in power feared the most. Tucked between volumes of official decrees and chronicles of councils were journals, not of kings or clerics, but of those condemned as heretics. These personal writings did not thunder with proclamations. They whispered with the honesty of ordinary men and women who believed differently. In their pages were confessions of faith that did not align with the official creed, memories of visions that shaped their lives, and testimonies of persecution endured. Some described gatherings held in hidden rooms where prayers rose in languages now forgotten. Others recorded dreams of a God who spoke in ways unlike the teachings sanctioned by Rome. These diaries bore the tremble of hands that knew their words could cost them everything. Many of the writers were silenced in trials, their names crossed from records, their bodies erased by execution or exile. Yet here their voices remained, preserved against time by the very institution that condemned them. The irony was stark. Those declared dangerous were not destroyed, but filed away, their testimonies locked beside the very decrees that labeled them false. To read such words would be to see faith not as a single straight path, but as a branching river full of currents both embraced and denied. The diaries revealed not rebellion for the sake of power, but belief as raw as breath, written by souls who could not help but tell what they had seen. In their survival, even in secret, they became an unspoken record of the diversity of early faith, a record carefully hidden from the world outside. Deeper within the vault rested fragments that seemed to speak of knowledge far ahead of its time. These were not fanciful tales or allegories, but precise descriptions of tools, mechanisms, and concepts that would not appear in common use until centuries later. Some manuscripts hinted at devices that harnessed the stars for navigation with an accuracy unthinkable for their age. Others contained diagrams of gears, levers, and systems resembling engines, sketched in the margins by hands that clearly grasped the science they were attempting to describe. To hold such a fragment was to wonder whether these writers had glimpsed something forgotten, or whether civilizations before us walked closer to innovation than we ever believed. If released, such writings would have reshaped the order of knowledge, perhaps altering the balance of kingdoms and the growth of industries. Instead, they were sealed, not lost but imprisoned, as though the world was not yet ready to carry their weight. The Church preserved them in silence, wary of what change they might spark if they fell into the wrong hands. For those who uncovered even a few lines, it became clear that human history is not a steady climb of progress, but a winding path with peaks hidden in shadow. The vault did not erase those peaks, it buried them, waiting for an age when truth could no longer be contained. The manuscripts were reminders that time does not always move forward evenly, and that perhaps what we call invention is sometimes only rediscovery. Not all the manuscripts in the vault were preserved in perfect form. Some arrived as fragments, half burned, their edges blackened and brittle, the words within only partly visible. These were texts meant to be destroyed, condemned as dangerous, and yet through some act of defiance or mercy, they were hidden instead. Archivists long ago chose preservation over fire, slipping the remnants into the shadows where they could not be seen but also could not be lost. The damage told its own story, flames licking across pages, as if history itself had tried to erase them. Ink blurred into smoke stains, margins crumbled under the slightest touch, and yet sentences survived, sharp enough to reveal what the fire failed to consume. The irony was that these ruined pages carried even greater weight, for their very survival suggested a battle over knowledge, a struggle between destruction and memory. The words that remained spoke of councils never recorded, visions not sanctioned, discoveries branded too dangerous for daylight. These scraps, fragile as dust, carried truths that someone had risked everything to protect. They were incomplete, but in their brokenness, they offered glimpses of a larger whole, hints of stories we will never fully recover. To look at them was to be reminded that history is not always lost by accident. Sometimes it is taken from us, and only fragments remain as evidence of what was stolen. In the vault, those burned pages rested as silent survivors, witnesses to both the fury that tried to consume them and the quiet hand that saved them from total ash. Amid the shelves of decrees and chronicles there lay a letter that was never sent, its seal unbroken, its words unread by the one it was meant for. Addressed to a pope whose name echoed through history, it carried a plea so urgent that it trembled through every line. The writer, believed to be a scholar or perhaps a priest, begged that the church reconsider its silence, that certain truths be released before they were lost forever. The letter spoke of knowledge withheld, discoveries that could benefit not only the faithful, but all of humanity. Yet it also revealed fear. The author wrote with reverence, but also with desperation, aware that his appeal might cost him his life if it reached the wrong hands. The fact that the letter was preserved in the vault rather than destroyed suggests that it was intercepted, read by guardians of secrecy, and locked away to prevent its message from ever reaching its destination. To unfold it centuries later was to hear the voice of a man crying across time, his words still sealed in wax, his hope unanswered. What he longed to reveal remains uncertain, but the weight of his appeal could be felt even in the careful strokes of ink. It was not rebellion he sought, but truth, a truth he believed too important to remain in shadow. That it was never delivered is evidence of how tightly the vault controlled what was allowed to pass into history. One letter, unsent, became a symbol of countless voices silenced before they could change the world. Those who spent their lives in the archive often spoke, when they dared, of a strange practice that occurred in secret. The shelves, they said, did not stay fixed. Every few years, certain sections would be shifted, entire collections moved deeper, reclassified, or sealed in chests that no ordinary archivist could touch. No explanation was given, no record left behind, as if the movement itself was meant to erase the memory of what had once been accessible. This was not simple housekeeping. It was deliberate. The shifting of shelves created a living maze where the path to forbidden knowledge could never be mapped. Scholars who return year after year in hopes of revisiting a manuscript sometimes found that it no longer existed in the catalog, or that the very title of the work had been struck away. Some volumes disappeared entirely, not destroyed, but hidden so carefully that only those sworn to the deepest levels of secrecy could find them again. The effect was as much psychological as physical. It reminded everyone who served within those halls that they were never in control, that the knowledge they handled was permitted only for a time and could vanish without warning. This constant reshaping of the archive kept even its caretakers in a state of uncertainty, ensuring that no one could ever claim to know all that the vault contained. It was a silence made visible, a reminder that history here was not fixed, but carefully arranged, sometimes rearranged, to maintain the shape of a story the outside world was meant to believe. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. Among the texts concealed in the vault were descriptions of angels that bore little resemblance to the serene figures painted on chapel ceilings. These accounts came from early writings, visions preserved by men who claimed to have seen the heavenly realm in its rawest form. In their words, angels were not gentle messengers with soft wings and glowing faces, but forces of overwhelming power, beings of fire and storm that shook the ground and split the skies. They were described as circles of flame, as voices that roared like thunder, as forms too vast for human eyes to contain. The effect of reading such passages was unsettling, for it stripped away centuries of softened imagery and revealed something far more fearsome. These visions were not meant to comfort, they were meant to terrify, to remind mankind that the divine was not safe but untamable. The contrast between these ancient depictions and the familiar icons of stained glass is striking, and perhaps that is why they were hidden. To share them openly would have challenged the delicate balance between reverence and fear, faith and order. Yet in the vault, their words remained intact, untouched by the outside world, preserved as a record of how the earliest believers truly saw the beings they worshipped. To encounter them was to confront the possibility that our picture of the divine is less a reflection of truth and more a careful reshaping over time. These writings served as a reminder that what is holy is also terrible, and that mystery cannot always be dressed in beauty without losing its edge. Among the many sealed volumes was one that bore the name of an astronomer, a figure remembered in fragments of history but rarely acknowledged in full. His writings described the heavens with a precision that startled even modern readers. Yet within those pages was a warning. He wrote of skies that did not match the patterns we now recognize. Constellations shifted in ways that suggested great upheaval in the memory of the world. His language was cautious, as though he knew the danger of revealing too much. The stars, he claimed, told a story that contradicted the accepted timeline of creation and order. If such words had reached the wider public in his time, they would have unsettled both the faithful and the learned. His work was quietly seized, locked away in the vault, and only whispers of his name passed through the centuries. The thought that the heavens themselves once looked different, and that someone recorded it, unsettles our idea of permanence. It suggests that our understanding of time, of the Earth's place in the cosmos, may not be as stable as we are taught. His warning, preserved in silence, was not about rebellion or disbelief, but about truth too heavy for his age to bear. In the vault, his words remain like a lantern unlit, waiting for a reader brave enough to consider what it would mean if the sky itself has changed. Whispers told of something even more unsettling than the documents themselves, an index written in secret, known only by a handful of archivists. It was said to be a catalog of titles so forbidden that even their names were not permitted in the official records. This index, sometimes called the skeleton list, contained references to works sealed away so tightly that no scholar outside the vault could ever request them. Unlike the public inventories available to select researchers, this hidden register was not bound in ornate leather or decorated with gold, but plain, functional, almost lifeless in its appearance. Its simplicity was deliberate, designed to draw no attention, to conceal its significance. Within its pages were coded entries pointing to shelves few would ever see, shelves that might contain lost gospels, suppressed histories, or writings from cultures the world no longer remembers. The existence of this index was never confirmed publicly, yet too many who served in the deepest corners of the archives spoke of it for it to be dismissed as myth. Its purpose was control, a way to ensure that even among the few granted access, no one could stumble upon truths unintended for their eyes. The index itself became a symbol of absence, a reminder that history is not only about what is preserved, but about what is hidden deliberately. To know of it was to understand that behind every shelf of accepted knowledge lay another layer, darker and more dangerous, kept under lock not for preservation but for power. Buried in the vault are records tied to the long shadow of the Inquisition, pages filled with testimonies, confessions, and judgments that never reached the public. These were not the familiar documents of trials already studied by historians, but files sealed in silence, too damaging to be released. Some of them told of individuals accused not for heresy of doctrine, but for knowledge, ideas of medicine, astronomy, or natural philosophy that threatened the authority of those who claimed to speak for God. Others recounted visions and encounters that unsettled the neat boundaries between faith and fear, testimony recorded under pressure but carrying details too strange to dismiss. There were transcripts of interrogations where answers seemed rehearsed, but between the lines lay glimpses of truths the Church could not permit to spread. Many of the names written in those records vanished from history, their families erased, their stories forgotten outside these hidden pages. In the silence of the vault, however, their voices endured, trapped in ink, waiting for someone to hear them again. These documents revealed the Inquisition not only as an instrument of punishment, but as a machine of concealment, gathering knowledge in order to lock it away. The vault became both courtroom and prison, holding not only those who lived through the trials, but also the knowledge they carried. To open such files centuries later is to step into a chamber of sorrow, to hear the whispers of men and women who pleaded to be remembered. They remind us that history is shaped not only by the victors, but by those who were silenced, whose truths remain chained in hidden rooms beneath the earth. In those testimonies, one can still hear the echo of fear, but also the stubborn survival of memory. Among the countless volumes and scrolls in the vault, some of the most unsettling are not the grand works of theology or the decrees of councils, but the small, almost overlooked details hidden in the margins of manuscripts. Scholars who whispered of them described faint sketches, pressed between lines of text, images drawn by unknown hands centuries ago. Faces peered from corners of parchment where no illustration was expected, their eyes wide and unfamiliar. Strange creatures, neither fully human nor animal, were etched in faint strokes, their forms both unsettling and intriguing. Symbols appeared, circles, and intersecting lines that resembled patterns later seen in alchemy or astronomy, though their exact meaning remains unclear. These marginalia seemed out of place, as if the scribes themselves had glimpsed something they could not explain, and, unable to include it openly, slipped it quietly into the page. Some showed figures with wings not of feathers but of light. Others displayed towers or machines that bore no resemblance to anything built in their age. Over time, these sketches became evidence of visions or memories preserved where they would be least noticed. They were not included in the catalogs or referenced in the official indexes. Yet their presence was undeniable. To stare at them was to feel the uneasy sense that the vault held more than words, that it preserved glimpses of realities our history has chosen to ignore. These fragments in the margins were not explanations, but questions, reminders that mystery often hides in the smallest details. They seemed almost alive, like silent witnesses drawn by hands long gone, watching those who dared to turn the pages centuries later. Those who stepped into the vault often spoke of a cold that clung to the skin, a chill that could not be explained by stone walls or the absence of sunlight. It was not the ordinary dampness of basements or cellars, but a penetrating stillness that seemed to press from the walls themselves. The deeper one walked, the stronger it became, until the air felt almost heavy, as if filled with the weight of centuries. Candles flickered even when no draft could be found, their flames bending slightly as though moved by something unseen. Scholars who spent long hours in those chambers described a quiet that was more than silence, a muffled absence that seemed to swallow even their own footsteps. Some said the cold was a natural result of being underground, but others felt it was the presence of time itself, thick and immovable, collected in layers around the shelves. The vault seemed to carry memory not just in the texts it contained, but in the very air, a memory that unsettled those who lingered too long. There were tales of archivists who could not remain in certain chambers for more than a few moments before feeling their breath shorten, their hands tremble. The chill was not only physical, but spiritual, as though the vault resisted intrusion, warning away those who dared to peer too deeply. For centuries, this atmosphere became part of the legend, a reminder that the vault was more than a library. It was a place that guarded itself, a place where the past made its presence felt, demanding respect and caution from all who entered. As if one vault were not enough, there are whispers of a chamber hidden within the chamber itself, a room deliberately concealed even from those who thought they had been given the highest level of access. This secret within a secret was said to be reached only through a narrow passage. Its doorway blended into the wall so completely that even archivists who worked there daily could walk past it without noticing. Those who claimed to have seen it described an inner sanctum where the most sensitive materials were stored, writings so guarded that only a handful of men in the course of centuries ever laid eyes on them. Unlike the outer halls with their tall shelves and sprawling inventories, this smaller room held only a modest collection, yet every piece within it carried the weight of immense consequence. There were accounts of manuscripts that described encounters with beings not recognized by doctrine, of chronicles that contradicted the timelines of entire civilizations, of letters between rulers and popes that revealed alliances hidden from every official history. This inner vault was not meant to preserve, it was meant to erase, to hold in silence anything that could never be reconciled with a story told to the faithful. Those who entered were sworn not only to secrecy, but to isolation, forbidden from recording even their impressions of what they had seen. The existence of this room was never confirmed in any official document, and yet too many whispers converged to dismiss it entirely as myth. To believe in it is to accept that there is always a deeper layer, a truth behind the truth, hidden within walls that already seemed impenetrable. Among the documents most carefully hidden in the vault were letters exchanged between popes and kings, correspondence that carry the weight of decisions shaping nations. These were not the ceremonial greetings or blessings that survive in ordinary archives, but private exchanges where power spoke plainly. Within them were negotiations for wars, agreements for silence, and promises of wealth or territory made in confidence. Some revealed concessions never admitted in public, bargains struck that bent the ideals of faith to the demands of politics. Others spoke of knowledge discovered in far lands, reported to rulers who then chose to conceal rather than proclaim it. These letters, often written in elegant script, carried a blunt honesty absent from official declarations. They showed that beneath the robes of the church and the crowns of kingdoms lay a network of quiet understandings, each designed to preserve influence and prevent unrest. To read them was to realize how much of history has been shaped in secrecy through words never meant for the public eye. Their preservation in the vault ensured that the truth of these alliances, betrayals, and bargains remained locked away, protecting reputations long after those who made them were gone. The mere existence of such correspondence proved that the church did not only guide souls, it negotiated empires, and that the greatest stories of power often unfolded in ink between two men who trusted silence more than the light of history. In one corner of the vault, kept apart from the shelves of decrees and chronicles, lay a series of mathematical works known only through faint references in later centuries. These manuscripts were said to contain ideas centuries ahead of their time, calculations and theories that hinted at patterns in the heavens and the earth far beyond the accepted knowledge of their day. Among them were treatises that described numbers not only as tools of commerce, but as forces of creation woven into the structure of the cosmos itself. Diagrams filled the margins, circles intersecting with lines, forming symbols that seemed to anticipate discoveries only much later recognized. To the scholars who glimpsed them, these works were both wondrous and troubling, for they suggested that knowledge had been available long before it was meant to be. Their exile to the vault was not an accident, but a decision, a recognition that ideas too advanced could disrupt the delicate balance between authority and learning. If revealed, they might have questioned the role of the church as guardian of truth, or given rise to a science untethered from faith. Instead, the manuscripts remained sealed, known only by rumor, hidden like treasure buried beneath stone. The few who spoke of them called them the exiled numbers, equations so precise they seemed almost prophetic. They reminded us that knowledge does not always move forward evenly, but can leap ahead in ways too dangerous for its own age. In the vault, those leaps were not destroyed. They were held in silence, waiting for a time when the world might finally be ready to understand them. For those who sought access to the Vatican's collection, The barriers were as formidable as the walls themselves. Scholars from across the world, men and women who had devoted their lives to the study of history, philosophy, or theology, often arrived at Rome with hopes of seeing the treasures kept within. Yet what awaited them was not open shelves or the freedom to browse, but a process so narrow that it stripped away nearly all possibility of discovery. They were required to name the exact document they wished to see, citing title, author, and location, though these details were themselves impossible to know without first being allowed inside. This created a paradox that few could overcome. Those who succeeded were permitted only brief access under watchful eyes, never alone, never free to wander. The atmosphere was one of suspicion as much as preservation, reminding even the most learned visitors that they were guests, tolerated but never trusted. Requests for broader exploration were denied with polite firmness, explanations cloaked in words of fragility and safeguarding. Yet behind this veneer was the unspoken truth that the greatest danger was not damage to parchment, but revelation of content. Many scholars left disheartened, their notes filled with gaps, their questions unanswered. Some quietly admitted that the denial itself spoke louder than any book they might have read. The vault was not a library in the sense of access. It was a fortress, and those outside its highest circles were never permitted more than a glimpse. In this way, the Church ensured that history remained carefully shaped, never fully surrendered to open inquiry. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. The vault did not guard itself by walls and locks alone. Across centuries, there existed a group often referred to in whispers as the invisible censors, men tasked with ensuring that nothing within its shelves reached the world unfiltered. Their work was not dramatic. There were no grand proclamations or public condemnations. Instead, their power lay in quiet decisions, the careful removal of references, the striking of names, the suppression of certain passages in favor of others. They were trained not only in scholarship but in discretion. Men who understood that history was as much about what was hidden as what was revealed. Some were priests, others scholars themselves, all bound by loyalty to an authority that demanded obedience. Their task was endless, for as new texts arrived in the Vatican, they combed them for details that strayed beyond accepted doctrine or threatened established order. In this way, even documents allowed into daylight were already filtered, reshaped, before reaching the hands of the faithful. To many who studied later, it became clear that the hand of censorship was invisible but steady, a force that quietly sculpted the memory of entire civilizations. The invisible censors did not see themselves as deceivers, but as guardians, protecting the flock from confusion, shielding the faithful from truths deemed too disruptive. Yet in their silence they erased voices, erased questions, erased possibilities. And so, their presence in the vault remains one of the greatest mysteries, for their fingerprints are everywhere, but their names are nowhere. They remind us that control of knowledge is rarely loud. It is quiet, deliberate, and nearly impossible to trace. In the deeper sections of the vault lay a collection of writings that chronicle disasters long forgotten, records of floods, plagues, and fires that never appeared in the histories taught outside. These accounts were detailed, written by witnesses whose voices carried both fear and clarity. They spoke of rivers that swallowed cities, skies that darkened without reason, and lands where entire communities vanished overnight. What made these documents dangerous was not the calamities themselves, but the timelines they suggested. Events that did not align neatly with the official story of the world. Some disasters appear to have struck at times when history records calm, while others seem to hint at cycles of destruction older than our accepted memory. The chroniclers wrote with urgency, describing signs in the heavens, tremors in the earth, and omens that carried warnings. If revealed, these texts could have reshaped the way humanity understood its own survival, painting history not as steady progress, but as a fragile chain of recoveries. To admit them into open study would have meant acknowledging that our understanding of the past is partial at best, curated at worst. Instead, the Church sealed them, preserving the memory of catastrophe while protecting the illusion of continuity. These records remind us that silence itself can be as powerful as any storm, capable of erasing the memory of entire generations. In the vault, however, the voices of those who endured remained, testifying to events too great to ignore, too disruptive to release. They whisper that the world has always been more fragile than we are told, and that beneath our confidence in history lies a deeper current of fear. Among the more peculiar treasures whispered about in the vault were ancient charts of the heavens, drawn with remarkable precision, yet depicting skies unfamiliar to us today. These star maps showed constellations slightly shifted, formations that did not match the patterns taught in astronomy. Some suggested that they were created in ages when the earth itself tilted differently, when the night sky bore witness to alignments long lost. The inked lines connected stars we no longer name, and annotations in Latin and Greek described heavenly signs interpreted as omens or cycles of time greater than human memory. To the Church, these maps carried a dangerous implication, for they suggested that knowledge of the cosmos existed far earlier than admitted, that ancient peoples may have charted the skies with a depth that rivaled modern understanding. More troubling still, a few of the charts hinted at stars and movements no longer visible, as if the heavens themselves had changed. To hold one of these maps was to glimpse a past that stretched beyond accepted chronology, to imagine civilizations gazing upward and recording what they saw with tools now forgotten. If shared widely, they would have forced a rethinking of both faith and science, blurring the line between revelation and observation. Instead, the maps remained in the shadows, rolled tightly and sealed, kept as artifacts of a world erased from collective memory. In their silence, they offered a quiet warning that the universe is older, stranger, and less stable than the stories we have been told. They remained hidden, not because they lacked truth, but because their truth carried questions too vast to be contained. Deep within the vault rested a manuscript known only by whispers, a text some called the Book of Bones. Unlike theological writings that offered guidance or sermons, this book contained descriptions of beings unlike any recorded in common scripture. The accounts spoke of creatures encountered by early travelers and mystics, forms that seemed human yet bore features that defied explanation. Some were described with elongated limbs and eyes that shone like metal under firelight. Others carried frames covered not in flesh, but in patterns that resembled stone or scales. The writers did not present these visions as allegory, but as encounters, observations of entities that unsettled even the most faithful. Margins bore sketches rough but detailed, outlines of shapes that resembled no creature we recognize today. What troubled the keepers of the archive was not only the strangeness of these beings, but the way the descriptions echoed stories from far-flung cultures, tales of giants, watchers, and wanderers preserved in myth, yet here recorded with sober detail. If such writings had been released, they might have woven legend and history too closely together, forcing the world to confront mysteries it preferred to dismiss. The book was bound in plain leather, without ornament, its simplicity betraying the weight of what it contained. Locked away, it became one of the most guarded texts of the collection, a reminder that not all mysteries were distant or abstract. Some had walked close enough to be seen, close enough to be drawn. The silence around the Book of Bones was deliberate, for it suggested that humanity's past was shared with forms the present dares not acknowledge. Among the strange texts preserved in the vault was one that later came to be whispered about as the Mechanical Gospel. Unlike familiar writings filled with prayers or parables, this manuscript described events that blurred the line between miracle and invention. The accounts told of wonders attributed to divine power. Yet when read carefully, they resembled the workings of devices or machines. One passage spoke of a chariot that moved without horses, its wheels turning as if driven by hidden force. Another described towers that shone with a steady light, brighter than flame, enduring through nights without smoke or ash. To those who heard these descriptions second-hand, they sounded like allegories. But to those who studied the vault, they suggested that technology once existed far earlier than history admits, remembered not as craft, but as miracle. The text was written with reverence. The author convinced he was witnessing acts of God, yet the details betrayed a precision that hinted at observation. The Church preserved the manuscript, but hid it from the faithful, aware that its existence could unsettle the line between faith and knowledge. If released, it would force the question of whether some miracles were in fact glimpses of forgotten science, moments when the past brushed against a knowledge that would not reappear for centuries. Locked away, the Mechanical Gospel remained both scripture and riddle, a text that carried within it the unsettling possibility that the boundary between the divine and the human has never been as clear as we believe. It was less a gospel of faith than a gospel of memory, preserving fragments of a world too advanced for its time. The question that lingers more than any other is why this vault matters so profoundly now. For centuries it remained sealed, its contents spoken of only in rumor, its secrets confined to a handful of men who carry them to their graves. But the world today is not the same as the world that locked those doors. The spread of knowledge is no longer limited to parchment and ink, no longer confined to classrooms or pulpits. A single discovery, once revealed, can circle the globe in hours. This reality makes the vault more dangerous than ever before. If its contents were once considered too disruptive for villages and kingdoms, imagine the impact if released into a world already strained by doubt, conflict, and thirst for hidden truth. Some argue that it is precisely now, in an age of division, that the world most needs these secrets, that clarity would heal the fractures of belief. Others warn that the revelations would not bring peace, but fracture faith entirely, tearing apart the foundation upon which billions have built their lives. The vault, then, is no longer only about what it contains, but about the timing of its opening. To release knowledge once meant for silence is to accept consequences that cannot be controlled. In this sense, the vault is as much a mirror as a prison. It reflects our fear of what we are not ready to face, and our curiosity about what lies beyond the walls of tradition. Its significance today is not only in the dusty manuscripts it guards, but in the way it forces us to ask whether truth, once revealed, can ever be managed. One of the most captivating stories tied to the vault is that of a forgotten explorer whose logbook never reached the eyes of the world. According to fragments hidden among the records, this man claimed to have sailed far beyond the routes known to his age. His writings described lands across oceans that official maps left blank, places where mountains cut the horizon in strange shapes and rivers flowed wider than any in Europe. He wrote of encounters with peoples who spoke languages no scholar could identify, their traditions rich with symbols resembling those found in distant civilizations thousands of miles away. His descriptions were vivid, almost too detailed to dismiss as invention, yet they contradicted the accepted story of discovery. For that reason, his logbook was confiscated, removed quietly and placed within the vault, stripped from the history that children would later learn. The existence of his journey was reduced to silence, while others received the credit for discoveries made long after. Reading his words would not only challenge the dates of exploration, but suggests that human contact across oceans was far older and more complex than we admit. The explorer himself faded into obscurity, his name barely surviving in scattered references, but in the vault his log endured, testimony to a path untaken. It stands as a reminder that history is shaped as much by omission as by record, and that the story of the world is never as neat as we are told. To imagine him sailing into waters uncharted, pen in hand, unaware that his legacy would be buried in darkness, is to feel the weight of silence heavier than the sea he crossed. Among the darker whispers surrounding the vault is that of a document, sometimes called the Index of the Damned. Unlike ordinary inventories that cataloged manuscripts by title, author, and subject, this list carried names individuals erased from public record, their works and memories swept away as though they had never lived. Some were scholars who dared to challenge doctrine, others were rulers whose alliances or betrayals proved too compromising to preserve. A few were ordinary men and women whose testimonies threatened the careful balance between authority and faith. The index did not hold their writings themselves, but the evidence of their erasure, an admission that they once existed, even if history denies them. To glimpse it would be to see the shadow cast by censorship, a roll call of those deliberately struck from memory. Each name was a reminder that silence is not absence, but choice, a decision to lock away voices rather than let them echo through time. The very fact that such an index was preserved, if indeed it exists, shows that the Church feared forgetting entirely. In preserving the record of erasure, it admitted to its own hand in shaping history, leaving behind a faint trace of the lives it sought to bury. For anyone who has wondered how many voices have been silenced by decree, the Index of the Damned would be the answer, both chilling and undeniable. To read it would not be to learn the whole story, but to see the outlines of a story we were never meant to know. A story measured in absences more than presences. Another mystery bound within the vault is the practice some call the daylight ban. Certain documents, according to scattered reports, were never permitted to be read under the open sky. They were handled only in dim chambers by candlelight, never to be carried beyond the walls or seen by natural sun. This was not because the ink or parchment was fragile, though caretakers, often gave that as explanation. Instead, it was a ritual of secrecy, a way to remind any reader that the knowledge they touched was meant for shadows, not for the world above. Scholars who encountered such restrictions described the experience as suffocating, as though the very act of studying the words was a transgression. They copied nothing, they recorded nothing, and they were watched with unbroken attention. The daylight ban transformed ordinary reading into a ceremony of silence, a confinement as much spiritual as physical. The forbidden texts ranged from accounts of visions to chronicles of early councils, where decisions were made but never admitted. Some told of rulers who bent the church to political will. Others described encounters with wonders that blurred the line between miracle and invention. Whatever their content, the effect of the ban was to ensure that these words never mingled with the air of ordinary life. They remained chained to the vault, preserved in darkness, as if daylight itself would expose too much. For those few who entered these chambers, the memory lingered like a weight long after they left. The sense that they had touched something meant only for shadows. The daylight ban was not about protecting the texts, but about binding them, keeping their truth from ever finding the world beyond stone. Among the sealed shelves of the vault were manuscripts bound with both wax and blood, a ritual sealing that went beyond ordinary preservation. These texts bore thick layers of crimson wax, impressed with rings carrying papal insignia. But beneath the wax, faint stains hinted at something more. Tradition holds that a drop of blood from the one who sealed it was pressed into the page, a mark binding not only the text, but the authority of the one who forbade its release. To break such a seal was no simple act of scholarship. It was an act of defiance against the will of those who ruled both church and conscience. The documents themselves were said to contain accounts of councils, treaties, or testimonies, so volatile they were deemed dangerous for any age. Their double seal declared that they were not to be opened again, not by scholar, not by priest, not by pope, and yet the very choice to preserve them rather than destroy them reveals a paradox. Why bind with such gravity that which could have been burned? Perhaps even those who silenced them feared to lose them forever, recognizing their weight, though they deny their use. For those who stood before these sealed volumes, the impression was not of fragile parchment but of power deliberately withheld. The wax cracked slightly with age, but the blood beneath remained a warning, a reminder that knowledge, once sealed with life itself, was never to be touched. The seal of blood and wax became more than protection. It became a symbol of fear, of truth so potent that authority reached for ritual to keep them buried. A pause is good, but the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. Among the hidden manuscripts was one that came to be spoken of only as the Gospel of Shadows. Unlike the familiar Gospels that formed the foundation of the Church, this text told stories in ways that unsettled even the most devout. It described events of Christ's life with details that contradicted the accounts preserved in the canon. Certain miracles were presented not as simple acts of compassion, but as moments of power that carried a darker undertone, a reminder that the divine was not always gentle. Angels appeared less as protectors and more as fierce guardians, their presence evoking awe mixed with terror. Even parables that sounded familiar were altered, their endings pointing not to mercy but to justice severe and absolute. The style of writing suggested it was penned in the same early centuries as other accepted texts, its voice close enough to lend it credibility, yet distant enough to unsettle. Scholars who caught fragments of its content were left divided. Was it a record of an authentic tradition later suppressed, or was it a dangerous distortion written to mislead? Either way, its existence presented a problem that the Church could not solve publicly. To include it would fracture unity. To destroy it would erase history. And so it was hidden, preserved in silence where only a few trusted hands would ever see its words. The Gospel of Shadows remained locked in the vault, a text too ambiguous to embrace, yet too powerful to erase. A reminder that faith is never as simple or uniform as it appears from the outside. Its presence alone spoke volumes about the complexity of early belief and the choices made to shape it. Among the more remarkable texts hidden in the vault were writings that drew unexpected connections between early Christianity and the ancient traditions of Egypt. These documents suggested that rituals practiced in the earliest gatherings of believers bore striking resemblance to ceremonies performed along the Nile long before the Church was born. They described prayers that echoed hymns once sung in temples dedicated to older gods, symbols that matched those carved into tombs, and invocations that carried the rhythm of Egyptian incantations. Some passages hinted that early Christians may have absorbed not only language, but entire structures of worship from these traditions, weaving them into new forms while erasing their origins. To those who encountered the manuscripts, this overlap was troubling, for it blurred the lines between revelation and inheritance. It suggested that what many considered unique might have been drawn from sources far older, reshaped to serve a new faith. The Church, eager to guard the purity of its foundation, could not allow such comparisons to circulate. By hiding the texts in the vault, it ensured that believers would see their faith as descending directly from divine revelation rather than mingling with older streams. Yet the presence of these writings revealed that memory is layered, that belief does not emerge in isolation, but grows from soil, already rich with older roots. The link to Egypt was not celebrated, but concealed, for to admit it would complicate the story of origins the faithful were taught to accept. Preserved in silence, these documents remind us that even faith is shaped by history, and history itself is shaped by what is hidden. Among the most unsettling shelves of the vault were manuscripts filled not with theology or decrees, but with descriptions of beings so strange they defied understanding. These were not the symbolic figures of allegory, nor the polished saints of liturgy, but accounts of encounters written with the precision of witness. Travelers, mystics, and even clerics recorded visions of forms that blurred the boundary between human and something other. Some were described as towering figures whose presence carried both light and shadow, their faces shifting as though no single shape could contain them. Others appeared as creatures with wings not of feathers but of flame, bodies that pulsed like embers, voices that split the air with sound beyond words. A few texts even spoke of beings that moved through walls or vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind only the terror of those who saw them. What troubled the archivists was the consistency of these accounts across distant centuries, as though different writers glimpsed the same figures separated by ages. Were these divine messengers, as some claimed, or something less holy, entities masquerading as light? The Church chose silence, preserving the records but refusing to name them, fearing what conclusions might follow if they were released. For those who read even fragments, the effect was profound. It suggested that our world has never been as empty as it seems, that hidden within its corners move presences beyond comprehension. Locked in the vault, these descriptions remained like warnings carved into time, reminders that not all encounters fit neatly into doctrine, and that the boundaries of creation may be stranger than belief itself admits. In the midst of manuscripts and scrolls, there rested an object that seemed wholly out of place. A fragment of metal crafted with such precision that it could not easily be explained by the age it supposedly belonged to. Those who glimpsed it described gears interlocking with astonishing accuracy, their edges sharp and deliberate, as if built for a purpose lost to time. The device, small enough to rest on a table, was said to emit a faint ticking sound when handled, though no one could explain how it moved without visible power. Some believed it was part of a larger mechanism, perhaps a clock or instrument designed to measure more than hours, perhaps the heavens themselves. Others argued it was evidence of a technology long forgotten, preserved in silence because its very existence contradicted the accepted story of human invention. The Church, uncertain whether to call it relic or heresy, placed it under lock with the same care as the most sacred writings. Its presence in the vault was an enigma, a reminder that history does not always progress in steady steps, but sometimes leaps ahead before falling back again. To encounter it was to question whether mankind once held knowledge, now lost, a science buried by catastrophe or erased by decree. The ticking, faint and steady, became a symbol of defiance, as if the object itself refused to be forgotten. Preserved in darkness, it waits still, a machine without a maker, a fragment that unsettles the neat boundary between miracle and technology. Those who touched it left with the feeling that time itself had stirred in their hands. There were moments in history when the contents of the vault weighed so heavily on the papacy that fear itself seemed to ripple through the halls of power. Accounts describe new pontiffs, freshly invested with authority, being led into the deeper chambers to glimpse what had been preserved. Some left quickly, pale and shaken, ordering certain shelves to be sealed more tightly than before. Others demanded that manuscripts be recopied and then locked away again, not for study, but for control. The panic was not rooted in superstition, but in recognition. These texts, if allowed into the world, could shake the very foundation upon which faith and power rested. A single letter revealing alliances with rulers, a chronicle contradicting sacred timelines, or a manuscript hinting at knowledge centuries ahead of its age was enough to provoke alarm at the highest level. The Church could tolerate speculation, but not the unveiling of documents that made doubt impossible to contain. This cycle repeated itself whenever new leadership entered, as though each pope had to decide anew which truths were too dangerous to face. Some shelves were said to vanish from catalogs entirely, their contents hidden even from the record keepers, known only to the man who held the keys. The panic of those moments echoed through decrees and actions that followed, shaping how the Church defended its authority for generations. What is most telling is not what was read, but what was immediately locked away again. Fear, more than reverence, preserved these shelves, ensuring that knowledge remained chained in the dark rather than risk breaking the world above. Among the strangest collections whispered about in the vault were letters written between scholars of faith and astronomers who gazed at the night sky with eyes unafraid of heresy. These writings spoke of correspondence not only with one another, but with something they called messengers of the stars. The letters described signals and patterns seen in the heavens, lights that moved in ways no natural body should, as though the cosmos itself were attempting to communicate. Some letters hinted at coded responses, exchanges carried out not with ink and parchment, but with observation, flashes in the sky answered by marks on paper. The tone of these writings was not fanciful, but measured. Written by men accustomed to precision, their words filled with caution yet undeniable conviction. To the guardians of the Church, such texts were dangerous, for they suggested communication beyond the boundaries of earth, a possibility that unsettled doctrine and threatened authority. Were these letters the imaginings of men who stared too long into the night, or the record of encounters deliberately forgotten? The vault preserved them without answer, storing the evidence but not the conclusion. For those who later heard of them, the letters were both thrilling and terrifying, raising questions about humanity's place in creation. If the heavens once spoke and men wrote down their replies, then the vault contained not just history, but conversation with something other. Locked away in silence, the correspondence became a symbol of questions too vast for their time, questions that still unsettle the world today. Hidden deeper than most collections was a manuscript bound in black leather, its pages filled not with prayers or parables, but with numbers, ledgers, and agreements. This book, known only in whispers as the Black Ledger, recorded financial dealings that few outside the highest circles ever suspected. Within its lines were accounts of wealth exchanged in silence, lands traded between princes and popes, and treasures moved in secrecy across kingdoms. Some entries suggested that fortunes were gained through arrangements that contradicted the public image of charity and piety. Others hinted at payments meant to ensure silence, agreements struck with rulers whose actions the Church later condemned publicly while benefiting privately. The ledger did not read like a theological text, but like a record of transactions that bound faith and power together in ways deliberately hidden from the faithful. To scholars, it represented one of the most dangerous volumes, for it pulled back the curtain not on doctrine but on influence, revealing that gold and silver flowed beneath the altar just as surely as incense and prayer. Its presence in the vault explained why secrecy had been guarded with such intensity. For to reveal its pages would be to admit that power was preserved not only through faith, but through finance. The Black Ledger was more than a book of numbers. It was a history of shadowed bargains, a reminder that authority is often secured not by divine right, but by coin exchanged in silence. Preserved under lock, it became a mirror of what the world was never meant to see: the hidden cost of power and the price paid to maintain it. Among the strangest volumes in the vault was a collection sometimes referred to as the Psalms of Iron. Unlike the hymns sung in churches, these writings were not devoted to prayer or praise, but to descriptions of instruments that resembled weapons. The language was poetic, yet the imagery unmistakable. There were verses that spoke of rods that thundered louder than storms, of blades that glowed as if forged in lightning, of towers that rained fire upon fields. Some lines read like prophecy, others like memory disguised as song. Scholars who glimpsed fragments wondered if these psalms were attempts to preserve knowledge of devices long forgotten, hidden in the rhythm of verse so that memory could survive while detail remained veiled. To the faithful, however, the suggestion was troubling. If these psalms describe not visions but real tools of war, then they imply that technology existed in earlier times that rivaled or even surpassed that of later centuries. The Church chose silence, locking the collection away, for such words blurred the line between miracle and invention, between revelation and destruction. The Psalms of Iron carried both awe and dread, for they sang not only of glory but of devastation wrought by human hands. Their survival in the vault ensured that no congregation would ever chant them, no choir would ever raise their voices to such verses. And yet, their preservation spoke of an unease, a recognition that these words mattered too much to be destroyed. They remain sealed, an unsettling reminder that history often conceals its most dangerous truths in poetry, and that not every song is meant for comfort. Among the records preserved in silence was an account that came to be known as the Misplaced Crown. It told the story of a ruler whose reign vanished almost entirely from public history. A monarch erased so thoroughly that even the lineage of his descendants was obscured. The documents described alliances struck and victories won, yet these achievements were followed by sudden silence, as though the figure had never existed at all. Some letters suggested that his claim to power clashed with papal authority, while others hinted at conflicts of succession that threatened to unsettle the balance between throne and altar. Whatever the truth, the chronicles of his rule were sealed away, leaving later generations with gaps where his name should have stood. To encounter these hidden writings was to realize that history is not only shaped by what is recorded, but by what is deliberately omitted. The misplaced crown was not just a lost figure. It was evidence that entire reigns could be lifted out of memory when they no longer served the story those in power wished to tell. The Church, careful to maintain stability, ensured that his deeds were silenced while his rivals' names endured in glory. The vault preserved the fragments, however, and in those fragments lay the faint echo of a reign erased. For scholars, this discovery was unsettling, for it raised a question of how many other crowns had been misplaced, how many rulers had been written out of time. The silence surrounding this monarch revealed that history is fragile, shaped not only by victories and defeats, but by decisions to remember or to forget. Within the lore of the vault, there lingers the tale of an archivist who vanished without explanation, remembered only as the keeper who vanished. He was said to be a man of great discipline, trusted with tasks that placed him nearer to the forbidden shelves than most of his peers. For years he served in silence, cataloging manuscripts, sealing records, and ensuring that order was maintained within the endless corridors. Then, without warning, his name disappeared from the rolls. His quarters were emptied, and no trace of his departure was ever recorded. Some whispered that he had read too much, his curiosity leading him to texts he was never meant to open. Others believed he attempted to smuggle a manuscript beyond the walls, perhaps intending to reveal it to the world. Whatever the truth, the vault swallowed him as surely as it swallowed the documents he tended. His colleagues were warned never to speak of him again, his absence treated as though he had never existed. Yet, traces of his hand remained in the margins of catalogs. Initials left on parchment slips, notes in careful Latin pointing to works later sealed away. For those who found these faint marks, the impression was chilling. It was as if the vault itself had erased him, sealing not only the texts he touched, but the man who dared to touch them. The story of the keeper who vanished became part of the silent warnings passed to new archivists. Do your duty. but never looked too closely. In the end, his absence became as powerful as any document, a reminder that secrecy demands not only silence, but sometimes sacrifice. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here, subscribe. Beyond the shelves and the seals, there was something more haunting than the documents themselves: the effect of the vault on memory. Scholars who entered spoke of how the experience followed them long after they left, not simply because of what they read, but because of what they were forced to forget. It was as if the vault imposed its own silence upon the mind, reshaping recollections until only fragments remained. The walls themselves seemed to carry the weight of erasure, pressing down on those within, reminding them that history here was not simply preserved, but carefully controlled. Memory became another kind of prison, for even those who saw glimpses of the forbidden found themselves unable to recount them with clarity once outside. Some confessed that their dreams were filled with images of shelves stretching endlessly, of pages that dissolved when brought to light, of voices whispering in languages they could not understand. Others admitted that they felt as if pieces of their own past had been taken from them, as though guarding hidden history demanded a toll from personal memory. This gave rise to the phrase, "the vault within memory," suggesting that what was locked in stone beneath Rome was mirrored in the minds of those who encountered it. The past was not only hidden in manuscripts, but also buried in silence inside the very people who had brushed against it. To think of history this way is unsettling, for it means the vault does not end at its doors. It extends into us, shaping what we know, what we forget, and what we are never permitted to see. The silence of the vault was not the result of chance, nor simply the product of neglect. It was engineered, built deliberately by centuries of guardians who understood that control of knowledge required more than locks and stone. Each generation of archivists inherited not only the duty to preserve, but the responsibility to conceal. They learned which shelves to make visible to visiting scholars, which to reclassify into obscurity, and which to remove from any record at all. This careful curation ensured that even those allowed inside could never grasp the full scope of what was hidden. Silence became a kind of architecture, layered as deliberately as the walls themselves. At times, popes ordered entire collections to be sealed with new decrees, forbidding their consultation under threat of excommunication. At other times, cardinals oversaw the reorganization of inventories, erasing trails that might lead to forbidden works. In this way, the vault became not merely a storehouse of memory, but an instrument of forgetting. To outsiders, it appeared as a place of preservation, but within, it functioned as a machinery of control, ensuring that history unfolded in the way authority desired. What was left accessible painted a picture of continuity and order. What was hidden told another story, one of conflict, suppression, and dissonance. By design, the silence surrounding the vault was so complete that most of the faithful never even knew such choices had been made. And that is perhaps the greatest achievement of its guardians. Not only the concealment of knowledge, but the concealment of the act of concealment itself. Among the legends of the vault is the tale of a single book that did not remain within its walls, a manuscript that somehow slipped through the net of secrecy and passed into the world beyond. Its path was never traced with certainty. Some claimed it was smuggled out by a disillusioned archivist who believed the truth could no longer be locked away. Others whispered that a pope himself, troubled by the weight of silence, allowed it to be carried in secret to a trusted ally. The book's content was never confirmed, but scattered references suggested it contained accounts of visions or histories that clashed directly with accepted doctrine. Whatever the truth, it vanished into legend, surfacing occasionally in rumors of private collections or in veiled descriptions written by scholars who hinted at a source they dared not name. The fact that the vault was not entirely impenetrable terrified those charged with protecting it, for it meant their control had been tested, perhaps even broken. If one manuscript escaped, then others might as well, each carrying with it the power to disturb the fragile narrative upheld for centuries. The story of the book that changed hands is not about its content alone, but about the possibility that secrecy is never absolute. For those who believe the tale, the book remains somewhere in the world, waiting to be uncovered. Its absence from the vault speaks louder than its presence ever could, a reminder that once knowledge slips the chains of silence, it cannot easily be bound again. The escape of one volume suggests a truth greater than the pages themselves, that no wall, however thick, can contain the restless nature of memory forever. The greatest weight of the vault does not rest in the manuscripts alone, but in the question of what such secrecy does to faith itself. For centuries, belief has been built on trust that the scriptures presented are complete, that the stories handed down are unbroken, that the guardians of the church preserve truth rather than reshape it. Yet, the very existence of hidden shelves unsettles this trust. If there are gospels never read, councils never admitted, chronicles never revealed, then faith is no longer simply a matter of devotion, but of obedience to a story chosen by others. To those who discover even whispers of what is concealed, belief becomes heavier, not lighter. Some feel their reverence deepen, convinced that mysteries beyond reach testify to the vastness of the divine. Others feel betrayal, shaken by the realization that the faith they inherited may be less the whole truth than a carefully tended version of it. The vault, in this sense, is more than a library. It is a mirror held up to every believer, reflecting both the beauty of devotion and the fragility of trust. Its silence forces the faithful to confront a troubling question. Is belief rooted in truth itself, or in the willingness to accept what has been allowed? What the vault does to faith is more dangerous than any single manuscript. It transforms faith into a test of endurance, asking whether devotion can survive when truth is hidden, or whether secrecy will unravel the very foundation it was meant to protect. When the heavy door of the vault finally closed behind those who entered, the return to daylight carried its own weight. Stepping from the dim glow of lanterns into the brilliance of the sun was almost blinding, as if the world above had forgotten how much shadow lay beneath it. For those who emerged, silence was not a choice but a command. Yet the memory of what they had seen followed them like a ghost. The sound of voices in the piazza, the echo of bells ringing across the square, even the laughter of children playing nearby felt strangely fragile, as though ordinary life could be shattered by a single page brought into the light. The manuscripts, the letters, the Gospels left below seemed heavier in absence than they had in presence, their weight pressing into the hearts of those who carried their memory. The door stood behind them, sealed once more, but it no longer felt like a simple barrier. It felt like a line drawn between two worlds, the world above, bright and ordered, and the world below, cold and uncertain, where history lay chained in silence. Emerging into daylight was not relief but burden, a reminder that truth had been glimpsed but could not be shared. And so life resumed, markets opened, prayers were spoken, and the city went on unaware. Yet for those who had passed through, the sun no longer shone with the same innocence. They had seen the shadows hidden beneath it, and no amount of light could erase what their eyes had touched. The question that continues to haunt scholars and believers alike is why the vault was opened at all after centuries of silence. For generations, it stood untouched, guarded by walls of stone and layers of secrecy. Yet there came a moment when the seal was disturbed, when the keys were turned and the forbidden shelves revealed. Some say it was the result of political pressure, that governments demanded access to confirm suspicions long whispered about. Others suggest it was the choice of a pope troubled by conscience, a man who could no longer carry the weight of hidden truths. There are those who believe it was not human will at all, but circumstance, flood, war, or accident that cracked open doors never meant to be touched. Whatever the reason, the act of opening was both momentous and irreversible. Once the manuscripts were exposed, even briefly, the illusion of perfect control dissolved. Word spread quietly, passed in murmurs from scholar to scholar, traveler to traveler, until the vault was no longer only a rumor, but a place known to exist. Its very mention carried both awe and dread. For the faithful, it raised the fear that revelation might fracture belief. For skeptics, it confirmed that history had always been more complicated than the stories carved into stone. And for the guardians of the church, it marked a turning point, the beginning of a struggle not to preserve secrecy, but to contain its inevitable unraveling. The opening of the vault was not the end of silence, but the first crack in a wall, centuries in the making, a reminder that no lock lasts forever. In that moment, the Vatican's greatest fear became reality, not destruction, but exposure. Even after the vault was opened, not everything was carried into the light. Shelves upon shelves remained untouched, deliberately left behind, their contents judged too volatile or too mysterious to face the outside world. Some manuscripts were too fragile, their parchment flaking at the slightest breath. Others were bound by seals so heavy with wax and symbols of authority that no one dared disturb them. But most were simply deemed too dangerous, too disruptive to be revealed, even in an age when knowledge flows freely beyond borders. The guardians of the archive made choices, deciding which truths the world could glimpse and which must remain hidden. In this way, the vault continued to live, not as an empty relic, but as a breathing force of secrecy. To know that certain records were withheld only sharpened curiosity, stirring questions about what knowledge was judged too sharp for human hands. Were these lost gospels that spoke of a faith unrecognizable to us today? Were they accounts of civilizations erased from memory, or records of inventions centuries ahead of their time? Perhaps they were personal letters, testimonies of lives that had brushed against mysteries too vast to explain. Whatever they contained, their silence was deafening, a reminder that even when doors are opened, secrecy lingers. The vault was not emptied. It was pruned, guarded, reshaped, its shadow preserved even as fragments slipped out into the world. For every truth uncovered, another was locked away, waiting still in the dark. The things left behind remain the heaviest mystery of all, for they whisper that what we know is only a fraction of what has been hidden. Those who returned from the vault often spoke in hushed tones of an unsettling impression, as if the place itself was alive. The shelves did not simply stand as wood and stone. They seemed to breathe with a weight of memory. Dust stirred in patterns that felt deliberate, and the cold air carried a presence that could not be explained by the underground chambers alone. Some described the sensation that eyes were upon them. Though no living being stood nearby, the manuscripts themselves seemed to pulse with quiet energy, their bindings creaking as though straining against the silence imposed upon them. A few claimed that the vault gave off a sound at night, a faint, low hum like the echo of voices trapped between the walls. To those who tended it, this feeling became part of their service, a constant reminder that they were not caretakers of dead history, but guardians of something still awake. The vault was more than a prison of words. It was a living memory, restless and waiting. Some believed the unease came from conscience, the awareness that locking truth in silence was a betrayal of both faith and knowledge. Others felt it was something deeper, that the accumulation of so many suppressed voices had created a kind of presence that refused to fade. The longer one remained inside, the stronger the sensation became, until stepping back into daylight felt less like leaving a room and more like escaping the breath of something vast. The vault, in this way, was not only a place of storage, it was an entity of its own, breathing still, reminding those who entered that secrecy has a life that outlives the hands that build it. The most unsettling moment for those who entered the vault was not the sight of endless shelves or the weight of silence, but the glimpses of what they were never meant to see. Hidden among ordinary records were texts that seemed to hum with unease, pages that carried truth so raw they shook even the most disciplined scholars. One manuscript described visions of angels so fearsome they bore little resemblance to the images of gentle guardians familiar to stained glass. Another contained accounts of rulers erased from official timelines, their reigns buried so completely that only in these pages did their names survive. There were letters describing inventions centuries ahead of their time, devices that, if released, might have altered the very structure of the modern world. And there were gospels that told stories with endings different from those embraced by the faithful, endings that hinted at a history less unified and more contested than we are taught. To touch such pages was to feel the weight of deliberate silence, the realization that history had been shaped not only by what was written, but by what was withheld. These were not harmless curiosities or dusty relics of thought. They were time bombs, each capable of unraveling the trust that held nations and faith together. The vault preserved them not because they lacked value, but because their value was too great to be released. What we were not meant to see became the core of its power, the silence thicker than the stone walls themselves. And even a single page glimpsed in that darkness was enough to change how one saw the world above forever. At the end of the long corridors and behind the sealed doors, the vault holds something greater than manuscripts and maps. It holds the weight of a history untold, a version of humanity's story carefully hidden from daylight. The records preserved there are not simply relics of the past. They are testimonies of voices erased, of discoveries silenced, of worlds remembered only in fragments. To stand in that chamber is to feel the tension between the history we are taught and the history that waits in the dark. One is polished, neat, and ordered, crafted to provide certainty. The other is raw, complex, and disruptive, filled with contradictions that refuse to bow to authority. The Vatican's greatest fear has never been that the vault would crumble, but that its contents would breathe again, that the silence would break and truth would spill into a world unprepared for it. The vault reminds us that knowledge is never neutral. It is guided, guarded, and sometimes chained. Yet the chains themselves speak, whispering that no secret can remain locked forever. Whether through accident, conscience, or the restless nature of memory, the past always finds a way to surface. The vault stands as both prison and beacon, warning us of the cost of silence, while calling us to imagine what might be revealed if the locks were ever broken fully. It is not only a room beneath stone. It is the shadow of history itself, waiting for the moment when silence gives way to voice and the real story of humanity steps into the light. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time.